here, and good morning to all fellow participants, evening, afternoon, whichever area you are logging in from. And many thanks to Nice for this invite. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cover it in a little bit of a different ambit and looking at the point of the Indo-Pacific architecture and what is India's role in shaping the architecture, we need to ask certain questions. So, first of all, acceptance is that the Indo-Pacific it's a vast area. We all agree upon that, mostly maritime. But all in all, it covers differing geographical areas. And this is where the sub-regions, which I'm going to speak on, and the methodology that India is using to shape a sort of architecture in support of the overall region's view of a free and open and inclusive Indo-Pacific is going to work. As far as India's geographical view of the Indo-Pacific is concerned, it's perhaps the most vast. It works from coast of Africa to the coast of Americas. There is only one or two nations who align with that sort of approach on the geographical region of the Indo-Pacific. Most of them fall short. I'll mention that by and by. So let's look at the sub-regions first of all. So if we were to classify the Indo-Pacific regions in several sub-regions, and we will look perhaps, let's look at the Indian Ocean region, which includes the Persian Gulf insofar as India and a few other nations are concerned, but it also includes or divides further into smaller regions of the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the Southern Indian Ocean. And then we go east of Malacca, you have the South China Sea, you have the Pacific Islands area, and then you have the rest of the Pacific up to the coast of the Americas. And I dare say I'd like to mention a point here is that in all discussions of the Indo-Pacific, South America remains largely neglected. We've had a few discussions with some South American nations, and of course, that missing element I also think needs to be engaged upon if you really want to look at the Indo-Pacific, but that's for a later date. So the question arises, if we are in agreement that there are sub-regions that we looked at, can there be a single architecture for the Indo-Pacific region, or is it going to be an amalgamation of the sub-regional architectures which have been in existence for some time, and some of them are in churn? It's been mentioned earlier, and therefore what is that we need to do to sort of provide a stability? But a little background on why I have this approach is that if you look at Barry Buzan's Regional Security Complex Theory, RSCT, it enables an understanding of the security order, evaluation of the relative balance of power, and the mutual relationship between regionalizing as well as globalizing trends. And now that we have many nations focusing on the Indo-Pacific, all from all over the world, I think this needs to be considered. And the interplay of this theory, the balance of power and power transition, is evident in the maritime practices of nations and also in the security architectures of the maritime regions of the world. So the same obviously would apply for the Indo-Pacific region as well as its sub-regions. Further, let me explain as to why do I follow this line, is that, there are four contours that delineate the regional security complexes, driving the balance of power transitions, specifically in India's areas of interest. These four are the durable patterns of amity and enmity. I think the South Asian region itself is a perfect example of this. You have East Asia, where you have North Korea, South Korea, you have the South China Sea. All this sort of underscores these durable patterns. And then, of course, within sub-regions, there are commonalities based on historical factors and culture. We can have an overlap, say, between South Asia and Southeast Asia, given the history and the cultural connects. But there is also the interplay between the anarchic structure and its balance of power consequences, which is a continuous process. And then, of course, most security interactions among neighbors due to physical adjacency as compared to the security action among states located in different areas would define the degree of interest nations would have in the whole overall picture of Indo-Pacific. For example, the state of play between India, Pakistan, or India, China may not be of that much interest to the Pacific Islands because they have their own challenges and risks. And similarly, in the East China Sea, North Korea, South Korea may not have that much weightage or interest by India, except the fact that we are strategic relations and therefore we would support South Korea. And the examples are many. So getting back to India's case, that if this be the case, then we are looking at mainly two areas of interest, and I will give you the areas as we have put down in the Indian Maritime Security Strategy of 15, two main areas, primary and secondary. So in India's primary areas of maritime interest is specific to maritime now is apart from India's coastal area and maritime zones, you have the Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, Andaman Sea, Persian Gulf, Gulfs of Aden and Oman, Red Sea and their littoral regions. The Red Sea has been referred to by Admiral Sheikh Hasina, and of course it is a huge problem in the making, can get bigger. Then we also have the Southwest Indian Ocean, including the IOR island nations and the African East Coast littoral regions. And then, of course, to this, I will add all the 11 choke points that provide access and exit to the Indian Ocean Strait, starting from the Cape south of South Africa, which is gaining prominence due to rerouting, right up to deep sea straits of Ombai and Wetar to the east. Also included in this is other areas encompassing the sea lines of communication, vital energy and resource interests. And I'd like to add an element which we had a discussion the other day, quite interesting, that we also now need to look at the seabed lines of communication, specifically submarine cables. There is very little, I would say, discussion on this, or perhaps it does not form the primary area of discussions. In the secondary areas, we have the Southeast Indian Ocean, including the sea routes to the Pacific and the littoral regions there, South and East China Seas, Western Pacific Ocean, Southern Indian Ocean, including Antarctica, the Mediterranean Sea, west coast of Africa, which we included because we have investments and oil interest in those regions, and of course our slocks towards Europe and America also via the Mediterranean Sea, which is presently reduced, if not stopped totally, and any other national interest based on considerations of Indian diaspora, overseas investments, and political relations. So, if this is the driving areas for India's view of the primary and secondary areas of maritime interest across the Indo-Pacific region, including the west coast of Africa, then we have a task at hand. And therefore, under the umbrella vision of Sagar, which has been mentioned earlier, I would say that India should look at shaping a favorable and positive maritime environment in the Indo-Pacific, which is conducive for all nations to grow and develop. And the methodology of shaping this favorable and positive maritime environment across the world, you can break it into three distinct approaches. The first is a standalone nationalistic approach. Perhaps you can put China into that. The second is through alliances, what the US and its allies do throughout the region. But the third is by a grouping of strategic partners working together in a series of cooperative mechanisms. And it can be argued that strategic partnerships provide a higher degree of flexibility that the alliances would be restricted in providing. Therefore, to my mind, this approach is most favorable, and this is what India does for a diverse and large area like the Indo-Pacific. And of course, strategic partnerships working with alliance partners would be able to ensure the common vision of a free and open and prosperous Indo-Pacific. So while the first approach singularly serves the national interests of one nation, the second and third serve a mutual aim with the distinct difference that alliances also encompass a collective hard security arrangement based on trust and a firm commitment. And it can be argued that these sort of alliances provide a security blanket under which strategic partnerships and the whole gamut of multi and minilateral approaches in the Indo-Pacific can work to a comfortable degree. The common factor in all the three approaches is that while addressing threats, challenges, and risks, they also aim to influence the national policies and outlooks of other nations. This is a point of caution because if you're going to be inclusive and engage all nations, then do remember smaller nations have a tendency to get overwhelmed by larger nations. This is something that India, especially in its neighborhood and immediate area, should look out at. And therefore, let's take a look at how the engagement or under India's Indo-Pacific strategy, which of course the ambassador said we don't have one, but for the sake of this discussion, let's call it a strategy or a policy or an outreach, if you would please. So then Sagar, which was or term in 2015, can be applied in any area. It's been discussed before. But let's put it as the umbrella vision of India's Indo-Pacific outreach. There are several policies or initiatives that India engages in there, shapes a sort of an architecture in the region. Let's look at neighborhood first. There are a lot of challenges that this neighborhood first policy is thrown up. And the question is actually, are we doing it well? Is it going well? Or do we need to take a step back and reinforce stability in our neighborhood? Again, there is a narrative that says that have we ignored the neighborhood while engaging the broader Indo-Pacific? We need to stabilize the neighborhood as it will serve as a firm base for India to continue engagement in the Indo-Pacific. So perhaps a certain strategic and an operational pause on the outreach while we stabilize the neighborhood. There are enough, I think there are enough sessions that we'll be discussing this, so I'll leave it here. The second is the Act East policy. It is ongoing. Is there enough thrust? Is there enough momentum? I would say yes, it's slow, but it's sure. And I think the latest maritime dialogue with Philippines, which is a bit late in coming, is an example of India's maritime engagements. And this was preceded by the sale of BrahMos missiles to Philippines and forms a part of capacity and capability building. And of course, this engagement Philippines adds to the list of Southeast Asian nations we have built. While we do not have a major stake in this in the South China Sea, apart from the fact that 55% of our trade transits that area and therefore protection of stocks, we need to engage the nations and shape a sort of an architecture insofar as any actions by China is concerned. I'll have a few words on China towards the end. Then, of course, look west, engagement of nations west of India needs to be continued. There was a gap in between. Most Western nations, Indo-Pacific geographical area stops at the western coast of India. It's sort of aligned with how the US looks at it. Is it a void in their approach? Therefore, it sort of signifies where their interest lies. But notwithstanding, India needs to provide the requisite stability and security, and Admiral Sinha has spoken about the Indian Ocean region earlier. Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, 7 pillars, very carefully thought out approach, heavily undersubscribed. If it is to be worked out based on the contours of the East Asia Summit, then somebody needs to be in the driver's seat. And I think India should take that on, and therefore we need to build more on the IPOI. All challenges, threats, risks, opportunities that arise in the Indo-Pacific can be covered by the 7 pillars. We know we need more nations on board, and that is something we need to stress about. ASEAN centrality has been spoken about by Ambassador Trigunite. There are differing views about ASEAN nations. Even ASEAN nations themselves are not very sure about ASEAN centrality, but yet it remains a major convergency factor in all engagements, and therefore India is on all ASEAN platforms. But the recent report by the ISAS on the state of Southeast Asia can be considered a wake-up call. So the question is, we may be doing well on bilateral platforms, but fall short when valued in a grouping. So if China remains number one in most areas as per these reports, while it is still a global and regional threat and challenge, then what is it that we need to do to raise our level and therefore be considered as a major player by ASEAN in the grouping itself instead of one of bilateral meaning? Quad was just discussed earlier, so I'm not going to elaborate upon it. But yes, there are many avenues that Quad can provide for architecture based on strategic groupings as relationships and alliances. Then, of course, we have a host of minilaterals spanning the IOR and Indo-Pacific. India, France, Australia, which went into hibernation for some time, is again slowly rising. And I think that's a valuable trilateral because we have three major nations who have vested interest in the Indian Ocean region, one, and in the broader Indo-Pacific. And then, of course, is India, Australia, Indonesia. Colombo Security Conclave has been spoken about. India, to my mind, in the multilateral domain, especially IORA, IONS, and BIMSTEC, should drive most of the aspects. We can look at it maybe as a more of a democratic approach, but still there needs to be a stake in this. And a lot of the avenues or initiatives that are sort of, stagnating needs to be given a push, especially BIMSTEC, because the instability in Myanmar and Bangladesh will at some point in time impact the maritime stability of Bay of Bengal, which today is perhaps one of the most stable maritime areas the Indo-Pacific has to offer. So therefore, we need to engage more. How do we do it? I think we need to actually have a brainstorming session. Is that, do we do it alone or do we get more nations into the Bay of Bengal? And that is where nations like France, Australia, any of the new European nations who wish to engage the IOR and India should be brought on board. Multi-military exercises is a high value engagement. We are having more and more engagements. I think for the last 3-4 years, we've had 1 or 2 military exercise added every year. And my last count for the institutionalized maritime exercises stood at 42, both bilateral and multilateral, including Malabar, including our own Milan, and many others. And we are engaging ASEAN as a group, ASEAN nations separately, and many other nations. And this, I think, provides for an excellent area in which you have a combination of a diplomatic and a military outreach, which is working wonders. We need to, of course, expand our footprint, not only in the maritime domain, but also by positioning more and more, I think, defense advisors across the, especially across the African eastern littorals, something that we are losing out to China. And do remember, if we leave a void, it's going to be filled up and not by somebody whom we would like to fill up. So some of these issues are going well, some not so well. So if India is looking at a free, open, and inclusive Indo-Pacific, then there needs to be an amalgamation of effort drive to that common aim. Hence the need for an Indo-Pacific strategy that will link all the policies mentioned earlier and optimize efforts in the areas of diplomacy, economics, and military engagements. And that, I think, we need to have perhaps have a relook at what is our process and progress in all the avenues which I've covered, but there are much many more. Trump 2.0 is an issue. So, what is it that we can expect from Trump 2.0? One is, I would say that if you look at the old reports from Trump's earlier at 1.0, which includes Indo-Pacific Strategy Report and, of course, the strategy document that came out, there is going to be a hardliner more approach on China. And therefore, I think the US is going to expect more insofar as India is concerned. And well, we will just have to perhaps live with it. But we need, I think there's going to be expectancy of more activism from India insofar as West Asia is concerned for a path of restoration of stability, which in itself will ensure that initiatives like IMEC may see light of day and I2U2 would be able to perhaps work even further better. But there will be a continued approach by the US to bolster India's capabilities to address the China challenge in the Indian Ocean region, with an expectation to do the same in the broader Indo-Pacific. If you remember the National Defence Strategy of 2022, it is the same sentiment with respect to the Indo-Pacific, that they will continue to increase India's capabilities to address the China challenge, which of course would mean that it leaves the US virtually little freer to handle issues in either the Persian Gulf or the South China Sea. Therefore, we can expect an emphasis on ISET, IndusX, for example, more momentum on defense cooperation, and perhaps a more specified participation or a widened participation as a member of the Combined Maritime Forces Group. Therefore, we need to stabilize the IOR neighborhood first, look at stability, stable connectivity and supply chains, which has been mentioned. And one example I can give you here, the shipwreck agreement with the US, where we have looked at various issues, but the proof would be that if the US would permit repair of US warships in India, and perhaps we can extend it to other strategic partners and allies, include Japan and South Korea. Therefore, you would have more maritime presence in these areas. And just the last word on China, sir, if I have 2 minutes more to go. China is a
Yes.
major factor and is going to remain one for a considerable period. And if we are looking at 2047 and China looking at 2049, then our growth trajectories are definitely are going to be in conflict and much more than what is existing today. And therefore, it will be a part of any Indo-Pacific cooperative calculus. China's interaction with nations varies based on strength, weaknesses, and competition that it perceives. We must always keep in mind that China will engage from a position of strength and an opportune time. Otherwise, it will remain low, and therefore we should not let our guard down. For China, India is a competitor, and any sort of perceived rivalry will increase as India's position in the global hierarchy rises, especially as an Indo-Pacific nation, and therefore the standing as a preferred security partner and first responder increases that ambit. For India, while presently the imminent Chinese hard power threat is on land, strengthening of the inherent maritime geographical advantage in the IOR will balance that threat, and that's an ongoing process, and in time tilt it in India's favor. In the broader Indian Ocean region, any Chinese maritime threat of consequence will take time to build up and will impinge the situation and engagement matrix in the South and East China Sea. So, therefore, towards this, as I mentioned earlier, the hard military element of US alliances and strategic partnerships will play a major role in keeping China engaged in the South and East China Seas, giving us the avenue and ability to establish a more, I would say, a more resilient structure in the Indian Ocean region, which is, you can say, as has been discussed earlier, is a highly disconnected region. This will require deft handling and an understanding at the political, strategic, operational levels regarding supporting deployments and actions in these maritime areas. And with that, I'll pause, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
I think I'll go on with questions and answers.